Pearson. I'm president of Round Rock Preservation.
Thank you. That was Frank Dar, our vice president, and other board members that are here and are at the front desk. You see, Amy, where did you go? Amy Petrovic. Did I get everybody? And to introduce the Historic Preservation Office for the city, we have with us today Kirsten Harding on the camera. She videos these every history program that we have, and they are on the website, on the Round Rock website. So if you miss one of these in person, you can log in and see it afterwards. Shirley Marquette, our founder of our organization, is here today, and then others from the HPL office, Lily Park in the back, and Krista. You'll wave. We're glad you're here today. Williamson Museum is one of our very best partners. Danielle Hock, the executive director of the museum, is here, and we're happy to have you here. Let me see who else. All of you who are Round Rock Preservation members, would you raise your hand or stand up so people will recognize who our membership is in the crowd? And for the rest of you that are so faithful coming to these programs and other programs that we sponsor, we hope that you'll consider joining our ranks as well. And this is Tim Todd, our speaker for today. And I will introduce him in just a minute. He's got, you can't hear? I will try to project better. How's that? I just want to bring you up to date on a couple of things that are going on. You know, we have mentioned to you before that we have worked on history narratives for the Heritage Trail West, and those are coming along. The narrative piece of it is complete, and the Parks and Recreation Department is putting the final touches with the artwork and the other information that will be on that signage. So we're looking forward to those being put in place sometime soon. And those of you maybe who are not from Round Rock and not familiar with that, there is a new trail that is on the west side of town. It starts close to the Round Rock, and along that trail there are decade markers starting, well, further west, starting in the 1800s, but starting at 1900, crossing the bridge, and then all the way through 1970. It goes to Main Street, and at each decade there are markers for history of Round Rock, what was happening in that decade. So be on the look for those to come and see. We are rocking along with our monthly history articles that are on Round the Rock, the Facebook page. Stephanie Tyler has been so gracious to publish those for us. Frank's article on Kenny Fort will be there this month. And if you have ideas for a topic, let us know what those are. And then our education programs that we have been involved in this year are moving along as well. We've had a great time doing those. All right, a little bit about Mr. Todd. He is a community leader. There are some of you here who know him already. Historian, and he's a builder. Remember that, there's a connection here. He's the owner of T.A. Todd Construction, and they specialize in residential remodeling. Located in Georgetown, he and his wife Sally live in Georgetown. And among his many civic responsibilities, he currently serves as the board president for the Williamson County Museum. So Tim's a third generation Todd family in in Central Texas. He learned valuable life lessons about community involvement from his grandparents, Colonel W.N. Todd Jr. and his wife Nan, and also from his parents, Lieutenant Colonel William Todd and wife Jean. That's been a little confusing for our internal group. Which Colonel Todd is it that's involved there? So both of them work. And his grandparents are known to Round Rock as the couple who purchased the Mexican school building and renovated that in the 1950s. They were part of the Army colony that Tim will tell you more about in a minute. And in 1976, Tim's parents returned to Round Rock after 26 years that his father was in service with the U.S. Army. And then 10 years after that, in Chicago as the executive director of the Glenwood School for Boys. Tim's father, Colonel William Todd, is also a Round Rock legend. He was named in 1995. That's a big deal in Round Rock for those of you that are new. Tim is going to tell us personal stories of the Todd's family's contributions as they experienced the rapid changes in Round Rock during the mid-century years and the coming of Interstate 35. I'm sure there's a good story there. And we are so pleased that you're here. Join me in welcoming Tim.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Glad to be here. Glad to see all of you. I'm going to do my best to tell a few stories and let y'all know a little bit about what was going on in Round Rock during the late 40s, early 50s, and 60s, and then on to the 70s when things really started changing massively in the city of Round Rock. Not just in Round Rock, but in Williamson County in general. Danielle is here, and I can tell you that Danielle is our very hardworking, very qualified, and director of the Williamson County Historical Museum, and she has been working really hard for a number of years to establish and maintain a great relationship with the city of Round Rock and with the historical people here in Round Rock. So, and we're proud of that work that she's been doing along those lines. So, welcome, Danielle. I'm going to start off. This story actually starts years before I was born. And I was born in 1956 in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But our family history in Texas predates that by many years. And mainly through the Army. I don't think there were any cavalry officers in the U.S. Army that did not serve in Texas at some point in time or another. And the cavalry officers that I'm going to talk to you about decided to retire to Texas after their service in the Army. There were 4 families that settled in Round Rock in the early 1950s. There were 3 colonels and 1 general. They all knew each other quite well, apparently, through their service, years in the service, which encompassed many different posts and bases throughout the South and in Texas and also in Kansas with Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth. Many of them, of course, all the men during that time period served, a lot of men served in the World War II. And all of these senior officers were accomplished General Army officers that worked tirelessly throughout World War II, and most of them worked in the Near East, some in the Far East, the Philippines, and Japan after the war. So they brought with them a world of experience where the U.S. military was concerned, and they brought some of that experience with them when they arrived in Round Rock. They had great ideas after they had been here for a few years. All 4 of these families there was Brigadier General Wessels. They bought a property that is now surrounded by the First United Methodist Church here in Round Rock. There's a little house back in the middle of that property, and that's where the Wessels lived. They also had a golf course over there, which was, I'll tell you one thing about these Army officers. They like to have fun, and they were good at it. They talk about the officers' club. Well, the officers' club was a real thing, and that's where they all sowed their wild oats during their Army careers. And they brought that same mindset to Round Rock when they settled here. And my dad used to joke that there was a party that moved from one house to another, and it was constant. And as a child, I got to experience a little bit of that, but really most of that predated my maturity, I should say. The other family was Colonel Ross and Helen Irwin. They bought the old, what is known as the Anderson property, which is now where the Round Rock Chamber of Commerce is located. But when Ross and Helen both were deceased, the property was inherited by their daughter, Betty Harriet Herman. And she was a great friend of our family, and I knew her very well for many years. She sold the property sometime during the 80s to a builder by the name of Burge, Ken Burge, I believe it was, and then he developed all of that area over there. I was just in there a little while ago, and just to kind of refresh my memory from having actually lived there for a period of time back in the 70s, and it's exactly the way I remember it, except for what they've done, of course, to do it to make it commercially viable. I like to tell, I'll tell this story. I'll share it about myself because I shared it earlier. Betty Harriet traveled. She liked to travel a lot. She owned homes in other parts of the world, in London and in New York City. And she liked somebody to live at her place, to live there while she was away. And so my wife Sally and I were between homes, and she asked us to stay there while she was traveling. And so we did. And Betty Harriet had an old dog. Its name was Sorefoot. Sorefoot, we called him Old Sorefoot. And he was old. He was blind and deaf, but he could find his way to the back door when he wanted to go out. So I would always go outside with him when he went out because I didn't want him to wander off. And it was a cold December night, or it might have been January. Cold front had come in, and the wind was blowing hard. I went out with Sorefoot and went back in the kitchen to get a jacket because it was cold. I went back out, and I could not find the dog anywhere. The dog had disappeared. And so I'm circling around the house, I'm looking for the dog, I can't find it. Well, right below that house is Veterans Park with the lake right there. And so I ran down to, it used to be a dock down there. I ran down to the dock, and sure enough, there's the dog swimming around in the lake, in the middle, going in circles. And not close to the shore either. He was in the middle of it. And so I'm like, oh my gosh. So my first instinct was just to jump in and go get him. And then I had the bright thought, nobody knows I'm down here. What if I get out there and I can't get back? And so I ran back to the house. I hollered at my wife, Sally, and I said, Sorefoot's in the lake. I'm going after him. So I went down to there, and I stripped down, took my shirt off, I had a pair of jeans on, and I went out and I got a hold of the dog and I pulled him back to shore. And by the time I got back to shore, I was about to drown. At any rate, I got him up on the shore, and he was alive when I pushed him up there, but then he immediately expired right there. And to me, as a young man, I trained as a water safety instructor. I taught swimming. I taught life saving. I trained many lifeguards for over a long period of years, and the only rescue that I ever had to make was for a dog. And the dog died. So that's my memory of that property. At any rate, Betty Harriet was expecting that. I them to drown, but she was ready and she had a casket all made for him. And so we put Old Source Witness casket, and he's buried down there. I can't remember exactly where, but anyway, I'll back off of that story for now. So there's a great book. It was written by a woman by the name of Linda Scarborough, who happens to be the editor of the Williamson County Sun in Georgetown. And in her book, which was basically a continuation of her mother's book, which was The Land of Good Water, which is basically the definitive story of Williamson County, and it's also an excellent book. There's a couple chapters in this book that were concerned what I want to talk to you about, which was the Army coffin. And in addition to the Wessels and the Irwins, my grandparents, Nan and Neely Todd, bought the Mexican schoolhouse up on College Hill, which is what it was called at the time. And they renovated it and added on to it and lived there for many, many years. Also, Colonel, let's see, it was Ruth and Alex B. McCabe bought the house that the Quicks live in now, which is right on the shore of Brushy Creek, right across from Round Rock. And they renovated that house, and they lived there for many years and raised their 2 daughters there. And I think it's interesting to note that out of all these 4 families, the military background was long and deep. One of the McNabb's daughters, Cheney, ended up marrying a gentleman that became a brigadier general. And then in the Irwin family, Ross Irwin, one of the grandsons, became a West Point graduate. One of my brothers attended West Point. My father was a West Point graduate. And I can go on because I guess that once that service, that type of service is ingrained into your family tree, it continues. I personally did not serve in the military, but my oldest son, Jesse Daniel Todd, served 22 years in the Army and just retired a couple of years ago. So that has continued. And the Army service in our family goes back, predates the Revolutionary War. So we can trace soldiers from within our family on both sides, on my grandmother's side and on my grandfather's side, all the way back to the Revolutionary War and beyond. So that's a long history of military service that ended up here in Round Rock. And that's just kind of a side note. I want to read, I'm going to share some excerpts with y'all about some of this stuff. I don't know a whole lot about what happened to the McNabbs and the Wessels and the Irwins. I know a little bit, but in fact, I spoke to Ross Irwin the other day. He lives in Fort Worth. He's retired. He retired from the Army as a colonel, and his memories are about like mine. From we were young, and so we didn't have firsthand knowledge of a lot of what was going on back in those days. You know, you reach a point in your life when you get older that you wish you'd asked a lot more questions to your parents and grandparents when you had the chance. And unfortunately, I didn't do that. But I will say that my dad, who was a character, a Round Rock character, literally. He became a Round Rock character and a folklorist, and he loved to tell stories. And so he did pass on some stuff to me, a little bit of what I want to share with you. I'm gonna share right now a little bit about the Todd family and where the Todd family originated. So William Neely Todd, who was the original Todd Sr., represented by this enterprising business, a man of Leavenworth, is of Southern lineage and Scotch heritage extraction. His father, Thomas Todd, was born in West Virginia. Whither the family had come from the north of Ireland in his father's youthful years. He was reared in his native place and early became familiar with life upon a plantation. his surroundings were those of slavery. So I think a lot of folks in Texas, mine included, has some slavery in their background. Not anything to be proud of, but it's a fact of history. And the sympathies of the people were with this institution. He always believed it to be a crime against the Negro race. When there rose agitation concerning the admission of Kansas as a free state, he, desiring to remove from a locality distasteful to him and wishing to cast his lot in with the free state adherents in the West, came to Leavenworth in 1855, making the trip by boat from Wheeling to St. Louis and thence by another boat to Leavenworth. Opening a private school in this city, he gave his attention to educational work, which I find interesting because of not knowing a whole lot about that part of my family. My dad became an educator after he retired from the service as well. So there's that. And I was always proud of the work that he did with Glenwood School. All right, so in 1857, his family joined him here, and at that time, he settled upon a farm in Pilot Knob, where he engaged in raising grain and fruit. From the first of his connection with the history of Leavenworth County, he was active in local affairs and was staunch in his adherence to the Free State movement. When the war clouds began to darken the sky, he supported the Union and was loyal to its interests. When he was very ill, the memorable election of 1860 occurred, and determined to cast a ballot for Abraham Lincoln, he rose from bed and was hauled in a wagon to the polls. It was the last act of his life. The next day he died. He was then 41 years of age. His wife, Susan, was a daughter of John Smith, both natives of West Virginia, while his mother, Mary Neely Smith. And I'd like to also mention just briefly that my name is Thomas Aller Todd, and we'll get to the Allers in a minute. And the Neelys, where my grandfather got his name, were also part of that family lineage. His mother, Mary Neely Smith, was born in North Ireland. The Smiths were prominent in the Revolutionary times, and during the Civil War were staunch supporters of the Union. In religion, they were Presbyterians. In the family of Thomas Todd, there were 3 sons, and of these, John L., who is associated with our subject, died at 31 years of age, and Thomas J. has for more than 20 years been engaged in the mercantile business at Fort Benton, Montana. The oldest of the 3 sons, our subject, was born in West Virginia December 1st, 1850. He arrived in Leavenworth July 8, 1857. After the death of his father, the family left the farm and came to town, where his mother gave her time and thought to the careful training of the boys. In March 1867, he entered the employ of Cochran, Bittman, and Taylor, beginning with a small salary. About 1871, he became a traveling salesman for the house, his territory extending from northwestern Missouri and southwestern Kansas. Quitting the road in 1879, he became a member of the firm, the name of which was changed to Bittman and Taylor Company, and he has since connected with this business. In 1891, the Bittman Todd Grocer Company was incorporated, with Mr. Bittman as president, Mr. Todd vice president, manager, and J. M. Gable secretary and treasurer. For a time, the firm was on Delaware Street. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with Leavenworth. I'm really not, even though I was born there. But since 1867, the location has been on 1719 Shawnee Street, where the company now occupies 3 floors, 52 by 125 feet. They also have a large warehouse on Main Street, Leavenworth, and warehouses in Salina and Hutchinson, Kansas. 10 men were employed to represent them on the road, traveling in this state and in Missouri and Nebraska. Beside his intimate connection with Pittman Todd Grocer Company, the success of which is in no small degree due to his ability, Mr. Todd is connected with other important enterprises in his hometown. He is a director in the Globe Canning Company. During the existence of the Board of Trade, he was for a time its president. He assisted in the incorporation of the Leavenworth Bridge Terminal Company, was a member of its first board of directors, and still is a director and stockholder. In politics, he is a Republican, and upon that ticket was elected to the city council from the second ward, position that he filled efficiently. However, his tastes are not in the line of office holding, and it is his preference to devote himself closely to his important business interests. Fraternally, he is associated with Leavenworth Lodge number 2, AF and AM Leavenworth Chapter number 2, and I don't even know what these things are, but, and then Abdallah Temple NMS, whatever that is. Like his father, he has always been a staunch in adherence to whatever he believes will conduce to the prosperity of the nation. And that was one sentence that I found very interesting, and I think has carried through to other members of my family, including myself and my brothers. The marriage of Mr. Todd and Leavenworth united him with Miss Hattie Aller. Well, I said there was that Aller name, and that's where it came from, who was born in New York State, and during war days accompanied her father, H.M. Aller, to Missouri. She is a lady of estimable character. You don't hear that very much anymore, right? And an earnest member of the Congregational Church. The children of Mr. and Mrs. Todd are Thomas L., Henry Aller, Sue Aller, Josephine H., and William N. Jr. So William N. Jr. was the youngest. That was my grandfather. And I have some pictures that I'm going to leave up here later. You guys can come and take a look if you like. Oddly enough, when I was looking through some stuff to kind of come up with some of this information, I found a coat of arms, of all things. And this coat of arms goes back into 1680. So I thought, okay, well, I didn't know we had a coat of arms, but now I do. To go on with what I was talking about earlier, and what the topic of this conversation really is about, is the Army colony in the 1950s and the impact that IH-35 had on Round Rock. So when these four families settled here, they fixed up some of the old properties in Round Rock, and they were happy with their lives, and everything was going along great. And then the Interstate Act was passed by Congress. Well, once that took place, it was a foregone conclusion that we were going to get some type of major highway through Central Texas. And there was a lot of talk prior to it ever even being known where the road was going to go. And it was basically decided behind closed doors what the route of that road was going to be. Well, when the ladies of the Army colony families found out about it, they were not happy. And because they had come up with this grand idea of converting Old Town Round Rock, which is over on the other side of the Round Rock, on the north side of Brushy Creek, into a sort of a tourist attraction. And there was some old buildings over there, and they were really interested in turning that into something that was going to attract people from all over the country. And then I-35 plans came along and basically dashed that whole idea, simply because it was going to cut right through the middle of Round Rock. The original route for Round Rock was supposed to be right out here on Main Street. It's going to cut right through downtown Round Rock, and it was going to completely destroy the business district of downtown Round Rock. Well, eventually they ended up moving it about half a mile west, and that's what dashed the plans of the Army colony to create this wonderful kind of a historic district that was going to attract a lot of people, a lot of tourists to Round Rock. And in fact, I-35 cut off the entire front portion of my grandfather and my grandmother's property of what was then College Hill, where the old Mexican schoolhouse stood. They took away, bang, they just took half of that. It was gone. And so that pretty much changed everything. I could go into a lot of detail about what all that entailed, but I suggest that if you have a chance to read this book, which is called Road, River, and Old Boys Politics, it carries a whole chapter about that whole situation and what happened. I will give you a few excerpts from that. So it says here that the Round Rock Historical Association, and there was a Round Rock Historical Association back then, that was formed by the women of the Army colony. And they're frontline troops. I like the word, those words there. They weren't just ladies, they were troops. And were townswomen, but Colonel W. Ross Irwin, a retired World War II cavalryman and civil engineer, inspired and commanded its maneuvers. So I like the way she sort of phrases that, because it pulls in some Army terms. In 1950, he and his wife Helen had purchased the imposing 100-year-old Washington Anderson house. Its limestone blocks, chiseled by a mason imported from Sweden. And the wash house, which is still called today, stood 2 stories tall and overlooked Brushy Creek. In fact, when I was over there, they asked me if I knew when the 2nd story was added to that house, and I don't. But it was obviously a long time before the Irwins bought it. The Round Rock Historical Association's board listed the wives of many of the city's leading establishment businessmen, along with the wives of several retired Army officers, veterans of battles in the Philippines and the Far East, who had followed the Irwins to Round Rock in the early 50s. The group, known as the Army Colony, came almost en masse, investing money and energy in the buying and restoring of 1850 era limestone wrecks, I think she calls it, as romantic retirement homes. In addition to the Irvins, General T.F. and Mildred Wessels purchased and renovated 8 acres and a Spanish colonial-style house on Brushy Creek near Highway 81 and 79 intersection. So before I-35 came along, 81 was the primary road between Austin and Dallas. And it ran right through downtown Round Rock. And Highway 79 dead-ended at 81. That's where it stopped. And that was one of the reasons that the engineers and the people that were planning I-35 didn't want to move it too far west, because then they were going to have to extend 79 all the way over to meet I-35. So they weren't in favor of that. At any rate, I've already told you about the old schoolhouse and others, so we've kind of touched on that already. Anyway, their friends fell under the spell and spread the word about this little place. They're talking about Round Rock. And Round Rock was a little place, let me tell you. It was, I don't remember what the population was, but it wasn't more than probably 2,000, if that. A scheme involved Williamsburg, Virginia, Texas style, was the model. The raw material existed west of today's Old Round Rock, a village of stone buildings built mostly in the 1850s, sprawled along Brushy Creek and on hilly dirt roads. The old town, originally called Brushy Creek, had flooded in 1900, and the village had ceased. Basically, it's people moved out. Pretty much, they kind of gave up on it. Let's see here. Page. At any rate, summarize a little bit and tell you that Round Rock business at that particular time was mainly driven by motor companies. And the Hennas were at the top of the heap on that group. And the businessmen of Round Rock felt like it would destroy the downtown had I-35 come in. So they forced it over half a mile and that's what impacted the Army colony's plans for the new Williamsburg, I guess you could call it, Texas style. There was a few other things. Oh, a couple other things I wanted to mention. That's basically a summary of kind of what I wanted to say. I could go into a lot more detail, but I'll be here standing here for the next 2 hours, and I don't think we have that kind of time. So, I would like to share a couple more things. So when my parents moved to Round Rock, and what happened was these military families were already at the end of their careers, and they were retired, and they were getting older, and they were, starting to die off. And my grandfather had a stroke, and the stroke paralyzed half his body, and he couldn't speak. So he could, but he couldn't. It was hard to understand. And so I never really got to know him very well as an adult, or as when I was old enough to, other than being a young child, I remember him very well. But when I was able to actually talk to him about stuff, it was hard to do because he was no longer able to communicate in that fashion. And so my parents moved to Round Rock basically for that reason. They decided they were going to come here and take care of his parents. And that's what they did. And both of my grandparents lived out their lives in their home and died at home. My grandfather, as I mentioned earlier one time, that a lot of these Army guys served together at various bases, either in Texas or in other parts of the country, but a lot in Texas, and many of them started their careers in Texas, either on the border between Texas and Mexico, or at Fort Sam Houston, which is a very important Army post for many, many years. In fact, both of my grandparents are buried in the National Cemetery at Fort Sam. And so we have pretty deep roots here in Texas, even though I wasn't born here, none of my siblings were born here, my dad wasn't born here, my grandfather, none of us were born in Texas, but we have the roots here. My aunt, my brother's, my dad's sister married a West Texas rancher and worked out of Fort Stockton for many, many years. So when we were in Texas, we were either here in Round Rock or we were out on the ranch. So I learned about ranch life at a very early age. And every time I would go out to the ranch when I was older, and we'd go out to visit my aunt, I wouldn't be on the ground 5 minutes before my uncle put me to work. But that's the way ranch life is. And so all of my visits to the ranch were working visits because the ranchers always need something. They always need help. That's just the way it is. It has been for a long time. I would like to entertain any questions y'all might have that I can try and answer. Yes, ma'am.
Your coat of arms, which is wonderful, I know you may not know very much, was that because of the old world, European, all that part of your history that came in through your Scottish?
Well, I'll tell you how I'll tell you why I think how the coat of arms came about. So, my dad decided to become a member of the Sons of the American Revolution.
Okay.
And also, I think my grandmother was already a member of the DAR, D-A-R, it's called Daughters. And so when I was looking through some of that stuff, just trying to get a little info on some of the background, that's where I found this coat of arms. And apparently the Todd name goes back a long way. It's a lot longer than I thought. And many names from back in ancient times, or not necessarily ancient times, but were found in many different spellings. So it's not just, we spell our name with 2 D's, but it's often spelled with 1, or it's spelled with an E on the end, or there's other ways that it's spelled. There are some kind of famous names in here that I thought was interesting. Was somebody named Sir Charles Todd, was an English astronomer who apparently made his mark upon the world of astronomy, but he was born in Australia. And then Henry Alfred Todd, he was a philologist. I'm not sure what that word is. He was a professor of Romance philology at Columbia University. So, and then I found some others that are doctors and lawyers and so forth and so on. Any other? Yes.
Sorry, for Interstate 35, I'm surprised to hear that Round Rock had input into where it was going to be. I always thought that was the governor who would say, we're in the highway department, Texas Highway Department, would make that determination. So I'm
No,
surprised that
they did come out and get input from
had
the
that
citizens.
input in there. So
Not
I'm
as much
surprised to
input
hear
as the
that.
citizenry would have liked.
Uh-huh.
In fact, that was one of the things that the ladies complained mightily about, was that they had already basically made up their minds before they brought it to the vote. And so that was something else to say. I don't know if any of y'all in this room knew my dad. I mentioned earlier that he was a character, and I wanted to just read a couple of, if I still have time, a few minutes. I'd like to share with you a couple things that he passed on. And here's one that he calls Christmas on the Ranch. He said, one winter I took Jean, that was my mother, to the Kennedy Ranch in West Texas for her first time. This was a place I visited annually for deer hunting. It was 1953, and I wanted to show Jean the Wild West. So we packed up our gear and the 5 children. As we arrived to the 50-year-old house on the ranch, I boasted of how quiet and tranquil the place was. However, that night Jean woke up and stated this was the noisiest place she'd ever been to. Indeed, it was noisy. There was calves hollering and windmills squeaking. It was Christmas time. I recall it to be the most memorable Christmas we experienced. It had been decided this Christmas would be a natural Christmas, so we put the children to work. They created ornaments made of nature using materials such as mesquite beans and honey locust trees, of which he worked with a lot in his later life as a curator for the Wells Branch Homestead. And colors to decorate the ornaments were made of natural sources. Old-fashioned candle holders were placed on the trees, and if I seem to recall, they did set the tree on fire. We prepared ourselves for the possibility of a fire with buckets of water and sand to snuff out the flickering candles. That evening, my dad also had a tendency to exaggerate. That evening, we dined on buffalo hump, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce. As our Wild West adventure came to an end, we packed up our old trailer and headed back home. On the trip home, we encountered 6 inches of snow. This is the last one I'll do if we still got a minute. So, one of the things that my dad kind of became known for in Round Rock was he helped a developer by the name of Jim Mills, who was a longtime Round Rock resident and an owner of Provident Development, who developed many subdivisions in the Central Texas area. And he worked for Jim, and they were in the process of developing the Wells Branch subdivision just south of here. And there was an old log cabin out in a field that had been abandoned for many years. And interestingly enough, the cabin is known as the Galt Homestead. Some of you may know about the Galt site, which is if you've never looked into the Galt site, it's highly worthwhile checking it out, because the Galt site has proven definitively that residents of our part of the world have been here for many, many years, 20,000 years. And so that's where some of the Galt started, was at this little homestead cabin, and then they spread out and moved north from there. But I'll always remember, because back in the 80s, I was working as a contractor then, as I am now. And Dad called me up and he said, I want you to come out and look at this old log cabin with me and tell me if you think it's worth the saving. And I said, okay, sure. I didn't know anything about it. So I went out there and we started poking around. It had 2 fireplaces, one on each end. There was a dog trot kind of set up. And the more I looked at it, the more amazed that I was at how good a condition it was actually in. And I said, yeah, you guys need to do whatever you can to save this thing. And so they did. They set about restoring it, and now it exists as the Wells Branch Homestead, which is a great example of a log homestead cabin that exists in, it's not in Williamson County, it's in Travis County, but it's close enough to Williamson County that we can kind of claim it a little bit. At any rate, I'll just read this and then I'll call it. The old log cabin in Wells Branch brings a piece of the past to the present. It was possibly built for someone traveling to Austin who was looking for a refuge from Indians and a place to acquire food and supplies. When I first came upon the cabin, it consisted of an outhouse and a rock smokehouse surrounded by an expensive piece of rolling hill country. And expensive it was. The cabin was made of cedar and grew as its owner's family grew. I must say that it is fortunate that the roof held up. It saved the cabin. If it had been lost its roof, it would have been gone. The cabin was first documented as owned by the Galts. I enjoy visiting the cabin a couple times a week and sharing the stories of the past with school children. It is important that the stories I tell have 3 important elements. That it is, my stories must have an element of truth, although the truth wasn't always necessary, are well told and entertaining. I enjoyed telling the school children about the calf ghost. It all began when I first looked in the cabin, which was full of hay. In the corner of the cabin, I could see an old cow had fallen through the floor and died, and it was still there when I went out there and looked at it. There were mostly just bones remaining and no foul odor. Later, after the cabin had been restored, I was sitting on the porch making a broom when I heard a funny noise. I got up and looked around and did not see a thing. Then I heard the sound again. The sound was as if a calf was under the cabin. While most old homes have people ghosts, I would say this cabin has a cow ghost. The homestead is overflowing with stories such as the one of the old coyote, as well as the wild bees who swarmed around Mr. Johnson when he was in search of that sugar goodness. He finally got rid of the queen bees and managed to steal the honey. There is proof that the stories told about the homestead are pretty much true because of the artifacts found, and that Texas will always be the frontier as long as the imagination survives. And while the homestead is a symbol of change, it links the past and the present. And so that's what I'm here today, to help kind of link the past to the present a little bit. And I've enjoyed talking to you today. Yes, ma'am.
You said your grandparents owned the old Mexican school?
Yes.
Do you remember the layout? Because
It was a one-room building. That I remember. It was just it was made out of thick stone, and it had one room. That was
But it was eventually 2 or 3 stories, wasn't it?
Well, when my grandparents bought the property, they added on a carport with a second floor. But and then they divided it up. They built a kitchen and put in some bathrooms and 2 bedrooms. So, and then later they added a front porch, which was screened in, and they added a back patio, huge patio. In fact, I heard my dad mention this a couple times, that the primary engineer for I-35 used to come up and sit on the back patio with my grandfather and talk about, and then they'd drink whiskey and watch the sun set. So he did eventually come to terms with it and made friends with the guys that were building it.
Did it have one or two fireplaces?
It had one, well, it had two, but they were kind of back to back. One was in the kitchen
Okay.
and one was in the living area. So it wasn't a true back-to-back fireplace, but they did share the same chimney. So,
And how many windows did it have? Do you remember about?
I remember that it had pretty much 2 windows on each wall, but there were more along the back and more along the front. And I remember one year, my grandmother said, "Hey, can you come and look at this window?" So I went over there, I started poking around. It was a solid stone wall, so they had built the window inside the wall using the standard methods for building windows in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I started poking around this window and I realized that the only thing holding that window in the wall was caulk. Termites had literally eaten the entire frame all the way around there, and the painters had just kept caulking it over and over again, and the only thing left were the sashes. So, I'm like, okay, but that's not an uncommon occurrence in our part of the world. So,
One of our board members, Phoebe Duvall,
yes,
lived in the Stagecoach Inn at approximately the same time.
that's
And
correct.
she and Tim were good friends growing up.
We were, and we knew the Duvalls very well. And in fact, they had a swimming pool, so
Everybody
we
contacted.
spent a lot of time with them.
Yeah.
Because there was no air conditioning back in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. She's sorry that she
Well,
said
she
she's
said
traveling.
she'd been here, and any other questions, I'll try to entertain them the best that I can. Yes, sir.
The Mexican school you mentioned, is
Yes.
that property still there?
No, what happened was, it was never listed as a historic property. And I think my dad might have done that on purpose, because he wanted to be able to sell it. He knew eventually that commercial was gonna just, take over around our past. And it would have limited what they could do with the property to the extent that it wasn't worth it. We tried for years to say, look, we need to keep this property, we need to turn it into a restaurant, we need to turn it into a B&B, Airbnb, we tried, literally, but he wouldn't do it.
Where was it exactly?
So if you go down Main Street and you cross over 620, there's a hill right there to the right. There's a hotel on that property now. And down below, it fronted Chisholm Trail, and it fronted, and then 620 was on the south, and then it was just open rolling property before I-35 came along. And so that's basically where it was. And there was wonderful trees on that property. There were it was full of oak trees everywhere. And I'll tell you something else that's kind of funny. The McNabbs also had a swimming pool. And so we were either down at the McNabbs or over at Beams residence, or remarried a guy by the name of Ned Beams after her husband passed. And but that hill down below there, if you turn right onto Chisholm, there's kind of a drainage area down in there now that's for the hotel. That was full of rattlesnakes. I mean, oh my gosh, there was loads of rattlesnakes down there. And us kids would go down there and we'd irritate the heck out of them, trying to, get a reaction out of them. But my mother had a fit every time we did.
Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I want to mention one other thing. Tim was talking about the home, the home that is on the First United Methodist Church property that Wessels had. That home was built, or Washington Anderson had it built for his daughter Chloe, and her children to come up here in the summertime. So when you think about it now, having to drive from where the Washington Anderson house is
Right.
to that property, it seems like a long way, but obviously at that time, it wasn't a far stretch. But that Wessel's house, and thankfully that's been preserved and is on the property of the Methodist Church.
I do have a photo up here of the old Mexican schoolhouse. So it does show, it had a lot of windows.
Yeah.
And along the front and the back. And I think it doesn't show any windows on the ends, but I think there were windows there. So
That's a
I'll
good-
leave this up here, anybody wants to look at it.
So I want to present you with a certificate of
Thank you.
appreciation.
Thank you very
See if
much.
I can read that. Tim Todd is recognized for his contributions as a Central Texas historian, community leader, and businessman. His roots run deep in Williamson County, and his contributions to our community will have a long-lasting, significant impact on Central Texas. Round Rock Preservation and the City of Round Rock Historic Preservation Office, thank you for telling your family story and preserving one of the most important historic structures in our town, although it's not there anymore. During the 1950s, we appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you.
There you go.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll stick around for a little while in case anybody has more questions.
Great. I failed to mention at the beginning about this throw that is up here. This is our fundraiser for Round Rock Preservation. If you do not have one of these, there are historic sites that are on here. We would be happy to have a sale made. They are $65.
Limited edition.
Yes. And Larry, quick, you wanted to give a message before we do door process?
Well, I want a personal story about General Wessels. He owned the property where the Methodist Church is, and immediately north of the house was a pasture, fenced in. Well, it's about 50 acres, and you have to understand that the context of the military lifestyle. They spend a lot of time being outdoors and exercising because that's their mission, is to be able to be ready to go into combat or to a war of any kind. But that also means they spend a lot of the time doing paperwork in an office. So the military combines these two by playing golf. Almost every military post or base has a golf course. And so that's occupied, that's the way they spend their afternoon time. Well, General Wessels had this 50 acres right beside his house. So what he did was he mowed it down so it could become basically a little miniature golf course, a 9-hole golf course. So right next to the house was the first tee, and then you played across to the other side of the pasture, and that was the green. And then right next to that was the tee that came back across, and so it was 9 holes that you played back and forth in this little rectangular area. Well, the children of the town, myself included, we very quickly found out that when the balls landed in the deep grass or in the brush, we couldn't find them. So that's, you find on almost any golf course, there's surrounding these fairways, a lot of lost balls. So we would go through and find those. Well, we didn't know how to play golf, so we would just throw it from one side to the other. Well, about the third week that we were doing this, General Wessels came out, and he had an old used fairway iron, 6-club or something, and a little putter. And so he showed us how to play golf. And so, we had no idea, how to do anything like that. But he was such a friendly man and a member of the community that you know, that was the first golf course and organized, sport that we had. So,
And
That's a
that
good
was
story.
before golf was really a thing
Yeah.
in central Texas.
right.
That's
Thanks, Mary. Okay, let's see. We are going to do door prizes now.
Did everybody get a ticket,
Anybody have a raffle ticket?
a raffle ticket? Okay.